Okay. So this is a short little essay I wrote trying to kind of, I like to rewild and retell myths with ecological metaphors to reroot them in their plant and fungal kin. So this is my attempt to do that as I prepare to write a long historical fiction novel. They who were two and divided became one and united. No longer were they at variance. They shared a single heart. The two were both one in joy and sorrow, writes Gottfried von Strassburg in his 13th century of the Tristan and Isolde romance. The two lovers, initially divided by the sea and by conflicting loyalties, suspended in a boat between their warring countries, are alchemically fused by accidentally ingesting a love potion. I have long loved Tristan and Isolde and its many textual variations, and I have always felt that the romance, although superficially heterosexual, is decidedly non-heteronormative. Across different versions of the legend, the lovers are not portrayed as practicing courtship or as falling in love. Instead, they are fused, chemically bonded, and afterwards they are not a couple. They are a single being that, for the sake of narrative tension, gets stretched and twisted only so that it can violently, dramatically snap back into its original cohesion. A man, a woman, a man, Tristan, Isolde, Isolde, Tristan, Gottfried writes, suggesting that what has been created is not a romantic union, but a single polygendered, multi-named entity. Studying the Tristan myth in college, I concurrently encountered Lynn Margolis and the theory of symbiogenetic cell evolution. Around 542 million years ago, single eukaryotic mitochondria and plastids started to collaborate. Is it eukaryote or prokaryote? I think it's actually prokaryote. This is an older essay, and I think I made a mistake. That provide the building blocks for our body, for plants and animals and fungi. Symbiogenesis explains that evolution isn't linear. It involves transversal intimacies and unexpected alliances. So I'm going to kind of do an aside here, which is our cells that make up our body are the product of these simple, original, ancestral bacteria half digesting each other and then never completely breaking apart ever again. So our cells are the product of this kind of anarchic lovemaking, or you could also characterize it as indigestion, two cells half digesting each other. So symbiogenesis showed that evolution wasn't linear. It involved transversal intimacies, unexpected alliances, tricky fusions that couldn't neatly be slotted into romantic seduction and partnership. Like Tristan and Isolde, originally enemies, it is hard to characterize symbiosis as tender, but it is certainly creative. And just like the union of the lovers creates narrative propulsion, so did the union of these original bacterial cells create evolutionary propulsion. Symbiogenesis not only queers evolution, it queers the idea of partnership. Your very body is the product of a collaborative and anarchic act of fusion. What if you acknowledge that your very cells interrupted the hegemony of heterosexuality? We need daily reminders that we are all mutually related and becoming. We need to slip loose our ideas of sex, our tired rituals of heteronormativity, and begin to dance with other species. Our cells are made of a love that is neither strictly penetrative nor gendered. When I think of Tristan and Isolde, I think of lichen. Albert Bernard Frank coined the word symbiosis to describe the mutualism of fungi and algae that compose lichen. The relationship was initially looked at with consternation. Modern science, in particular neo-Darwinism, articulated through the social stratification of Victorian England, couldn't understand two unlike organisms collaborating, and even more so, living inside each other's bodies. It must be a conflict. But I am reminded of the wonderful quote by Ursula K. Le Guin. Modernist manuals of writing often conflate story with conflict. This reductionism reflects a culture that inflates aggression and competition, while cultivating ignorance of other behavioral options. No narrative of any complexity can be built on or reduced to a single element. Conflict is one kind of behavior, there are others equally important in any human life, such as relating, finding, losing, bearing, discovering, parting, changing. Change is the universal aspect of all the sources of story. Story is something moving, something happening, something or somebody changing. Even today, scientific narratives are troubled by commensalisms and parasitisms. Who benefits who? How can we quantify and measure this complicated relationship? Recent studies have uncovered that lichen is even stranger than initially thought. Yeasts and other bacteria have been identified as members of the love union. This isn't a monogamous partnership. Perhaps it can't really be called a partnership at all. Symbiosis means becoming with. Becoming with is not a positive or negative attribute. It is a metamorphosis. It simply means to change. For me, symbiosis is the ultimate symbol of narrative propulsion. We collaborate, we merge, and we fuse in order to keep telling the story. And the story, like lichen, is bigger, juicier, weirder, and queerer than any of its single parts or characters that constitute it. Recently, I learned that certain compounds, including several of the life-saving antibiotics we depend on today, can only be created and learned by lichenized algae and fungi. Lichenized partnerships aren't permanent either. Fungi learn how to make these compounds and then later, separated from their symbionts, still remember how to produce them. Unruly collaborations create novel creative opportunities. When two narratives, seemingly opposed, interrupt each other, they can fuse into a new kind of story, one that, like lichen, can digest rock, liberate minerals, and create miraculous medicines. Or like the romantic human lovers I began with, they fuse in order to show us that storytelling should confound our expectations. Tristan dies multiple times. Tristan is Isolde is Tristan. Isolde is impersonated by Branya. Tristan pretends to be a feminized harpist called Tantrist. There are 3 different Isoldes in the earliest version of the story. Love blurs and binds. It transforms. Everything is lichenized. At the end of Tristan and Isolde, the 2 lovers die and are buried side by side. Above their graves, 2 plants intertwine. The fusion varies between versions, but includes 2 willows, honeysuckle and hazel, vine and a rose bush, and then in some versions, 2 thorn bushes. Gottfried, writing in the 13th century, chose as his source text the earlier version, Tristan of Thomas. The 2 romances overlap, but in an act that even more closely mirrors symbiosis, Gottfried died when 5/6 of the way through the text, and the only surviving versions of the earlier Thomas represent the final 1/6 of the story. Together, the 2 versions, like the plants above the lovers' graves, have fused and braided. In order to receive the full narrative, they must be read together. So yeah, that's my little Tristan and Isolde essay. Thank you.
Wow. I loved hearing that, actually. Thank you very much. And also very humbled, and I'm sure everybody here is, that you haven't read that out in public before. So I think that's just an honor to hear that. So thank you so much. I'm always intrigued by this idea. Well, in a sense, that so many of these ancient myths are really nature-based metaphors. And you are doing such a beautiful job in kind of uncovering that, for us here now. And I guess the question that I always have is, when they were written in their original form way back when, do you think there was any conscious idea that that's what was being written down, or do you think we're making the connections now later, in the sense that of course it's that way, but it wasn't necessarily done on purpose?
It's a great question. I think it's so hard to analyze myths that become text and become written down, because the truth is that most of myth, for 99% of all of human history, has been oral and relational and adaptive. So that it has to be told again and again in a community rooted in place. And every time it's resurrected, it changes to suit the particular circumstances of the moment, your audience, your own body, the environmental conditions of the time period. And so myth used to be highly contextual and highly rooted. And then when, with the rise of alphabetic literacy, you can write a story down, it stays the same, it never has to respond to an audience, it can be abstracted from the author, from the original location, transplanted somewhere else without having to take into consideration all of the different aspects of what it's being fed into. And so I think it's very hard to read myths that have been written down as representative of the original dialogue with place that oral adaptive myth telling used to be. I think one of the interesting things to me about the Tristan and Isolde myth is I oftentimes say that by the time a myth becomes written down, it's already been through 5,000 years of rewrites. And one of the fascinating aspects of the Tristan and Isolde myth is Tristan, the archetypal hero, is said to come from Lyoness, which is a place that doesn't exist in England, and in fact has been considered to have been a part of England that broke off at the end of the Bronze Age, so in 3000 BCE. So what I think is interesting is, so we have Tristan and Isolde as being placed in the Dark Ages, being written down in the Dark Ages and updated, but it seems to me representative of a much older mythic system in England that gets adapted and changed. So I do think we're missing quite a lot, but I would have to imagine that this mythic system, 8,000 years ago would probably be much more environmentally sensitive.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it works.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I mean, it does.
Does that answer your question?
It does, and it's making me think of myths almost like, plants, or as you say, like fungi or lichen, in the sense that if I take a plant from a different country and I try to uproot it and I try to replant it in Australia, it's going to be different. It's going to be different, and that's a
yeah, and I think that's. Yeah, I think I sometimes say that myths are like mycelial systems. So mycelial systems are the below ground fungal systems that produce mushrooms above ground. So they're these little thin threadings that connect trees, bacterial colonies, they're the connective tissue of the soil. And what they do is they map the relationships of a place physically. They become a map of relationships. And I think that myths do the same thing, is they're vessels for ecological wisdom and relationships. We know with some certainty that narrative is the most effective way to transmit knowledge through climate and social collapse. There's the oldest piece of scientific data and myth, it's both simultaneously, that we have access to, wasn't written down, wasn't carved in stone, it was held in breath, and it's from where you are. It's an Aboriginal story. About I forget, it's about a crater and a certain kind of meteoric event. Yeah. So I oftentimes think that, myth is a vessel where you place your relationships and where you map your relationships. Just like fungi map the relationships of a forest, so do myth map the relationships of a community in a specific place.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm thinking now of even some of the Greek myths are like that. They're more geo-myths. I'm thinking of the myth of Phaeton, for example, which was based on an actual event, I'm
really interested in geomythology, which is looking at mythology as being representative of real environmental experiences that we actually don't have the scientific tools to access, and that we can use. The myth often precedes scientific data in accuracy in a lot of instances. I've written an essay about this that it's called Boats of Breath. I think it's on my Substack.
I'll definitely have to read that, because I see myth as kind of pre-science. It's just the stuff before science can explain it in a way. And I imagine that people, when a meteor hits the Earth and they've got no other way of explaining it, then a myth is going to bubble up, and then over hundreds of years, that process which you've just outlined is going to start taking place.
Here's an interesting one. Of my favorite examples is Hesiod's Theogony, which is the clash of the Titans and the new Greek pantheon, is probably very indicative of a real explosion of Mount Terra in the Santorini cauldron that destroyed Crete and most of these Greek islands and was like signaled the end of the Bronze Age. So that if you actually look at this battle that Hesiod wrote down, you're seeing a description of a real event, of a real volcanic eruption.
Yeah, that's
Moving.
fascinating. That's fascinating to me. But I guess, moving us forward into
Yeah.
I guess more present times. Does that, in your mind, does that take away from or even negate some of the, like I'm thinking, for example, of um, um, Robert A. Johnson's kind of dissertation on the Tristan and Isolde myth, and a lot of people see it as the difference between romance and love, for example, when they're talking about that myth. So how does that work sit with you when it comes to the way the lens that you're viewing them?
I think that I'm really interested in orality, and in oral cultures, they have much smaller vocabularies, and that's, from a modern Eurocentric perspective, very easy to characterize as being like primitive or smaller or not as good. But the truth is that every word was like money with gold behind it. Every word represented a real relationship, a real being in your world. Every word had gold behind it. And I think a lot about the words that we traffic in these days have no gold behind them. And they're often been acquired through a colonial practice of going into cultures, taking their words without any backing behind them and adding them into our accumulative encyclopedias. And I oftentimes think of the anthropocentric terms that we spend so much time on, like the difference between love and romance, as being essentially money without gold behind it, words without a root system. And that I'm much more interested in planting myths in a particular place and seeing the actual beings and the actual, webs of kinship that come to infuse them. I think a lot that are, so there's an exercise I do in some classes I teach, which is imagine that your brain was totally erased of every word you know. Every word was gone. Afterwards, what if you could only get 50 words back for the rest of your life? Only 50 words. What words do work in your life? What words would you actually need, like to actually maintain a community and a life and survive? And let me tell you, it's not going to be romance and love or justice. There's going to be words like thank you, I love you, like, mustard green, poison. Like, they're going to be words that have real substance to them. And so when I think about a lot of like archetypal mythic analysis, I think it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Like, in order to survive the increasingly unpredictable social and climatological events that are to come, we need to create culpable, entangled communities rather than, these abstract human concepts that will not, carry us through the floodwaters.
Mm-hmm. I'm really interested to, that really lands with me, what you said just then. So I'll be interested to hear what others say when we open it up to the crew here and let them in and ask some questions, because that's powerful stuff, what you're saying there. And we talk often in this community about being precise with your words, but that's really taking it to a whole new level. And I think what I do see out there is it's a lot of word soup, isn't it? A lot of the workshops that I see being run, and it's
well, here's the thing, there's no purity. I'm the biggest word salad chef there is. Like, I'll add so many words to the soup that it makes no sense. So part of it is my own personal inquiry about, okay, but what words actually matter? When the grid goes down, when there's no electricity, when I have to like think on a day-to-day basis about how to survive, what will I actually be saying?
That's fascinating. I'll be thinking about that later, certainly. Which words, if I had 50 words, we'll throw it out there to whoever's listening either now or in the recording. It's a lovely exercise, actually. Now, Sophie, I'm going to take a big step backwards, if that's okay. I was really fascinated with how you came to this work. And I actually think that, there's a reasonable amount of alignment with my own personal experiences. And so I guess for me, my ears really kind of pricked up when I listened to you speaking about that. So I'm wondering, can we sort of go back to the beginning a little bit? And I've heard you speak in conversations before about, what happened to you when you were growing up, and this connection back to where you are now. And it's fascinating to me. I see it. I use the word biomythic quite a bit, and I think there's something
Like
biomythic.
that.
Yeah, I think there's something biomythic about your story.
Well, I am a survivor of early childhood violence and abuse, and it opened up my sensory gating and my nervous system to a kind of hypersensitivity that we can problematize or we can dance with. It made me hyper aware, like adults' micro expressions and danger, but it also made me more aware of the aliveness of beings often gated out culturally. So, like slime mold, insects, dirt, root systems, things that are gross, things that are small. And so, as I grew up, my genetic illness kicked in when I was 16. And I've seen that, my brother has the same quote unquote genetic markers that he could have manifested it and he didn't. So my trauma obviously activated and opened up my body to express the worst possible scenario of this genetic condition. But the two have been, and it's incurable and very complicated. And so when I finally got the diagnosis of PTSD, an inheritance of trauma, and this incurable connective tissue disease, I thought, where will my healing lie? And I realized that for my whole life, I'd been in love with fungi, which are the connective tissue of the soil. They are, they create the very structure and integrity of ecosystems, underpin everything. And I have a deficiency in connective tissue in my body. There are too many cracks in my body. And I thought, okay, there's no medicine I can take and put in my singular human body that will cure me. But what if I looked at healing as something leakier that, is rhizomatic with my ecosystem? What if it was about letting the connective tissue of the mycorrhizal fungal systems into my body and becoming very involved with them and their needs? What if my healing was outside my body? And so I think with fungi and have always loved them, but when I realized that I have connective tissue disease and they are connective tissue, I saw this resonance, that there had been this space in me that was a perfectly silhouetted invitation to dialogue with them. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty short summary of it. I'd love to hear your own, I know a little bit about your story, but I would love to hear a little bit about your own biomythic origins, Asher.
Yeah, I mean, it's and people here have heard the story, but it's very similar. Only we're just talking about a different part of the, because for me it's in the blood, and I too, I guess not knowing your background specifically, but similarly grew up in difficult circumstances, and for me there was something around. I had a story that I needed to protect. And particularly the feminine, particularly females. My mother and my sister, and I think that story for me turned into overprotection. That was the message I was sending my body, and so when a physical illness manifested in me, it was a blood cancer, an overproliferation of platelets, which is the protective element in the body, which I find super interesting. And what's more interesting is the mutated DNA in my body is actually named after a Roman god, the Janus kinase, and I've always felt a connection to Janus, in fact, which predates me even knowing that. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. But it's interesting to hear you talk about your brother, because my younger sister, we also had similar genetics, but they seemed to get activated in a different way. She ended up with chronic fatigue syndrome, and sadly ended up taking her own life when she was very young. But it's there's such a connection there, and I really understand that. And I found my way into nature, but in a different way to you, but connected to my situation. So that's why I think when I'm listening to you talk about that, it makes so much sense to me. And I don't know about you, but I've since spoken to many others that have a biomythic narrative as well. Um,
Yeah, I think that a lot of us, there's no ritual initiation anymore. And I'm always very, very hesitant to pretend that initiation is some kind of easy, workshop based experience, because like your sister, the initiations that you don't order off the menu, you oftentimes don't survive. I think of the people alongside me. In the past 3 years, I've had 5 friends commit suicide.
mm,
Like, people don't make it through the initiation. I don't think we can pretend like it's something that our cultures know how to do or how to hold. And most people don't make it. I think of Tristan putting himself out in the boat, the oarless boat, after he's wounded. He doesn't know it's essentially suicide. He doesn't know he's getting to Ireland and he's going to get cured. And so I think we fetishize the night sea journey, but most people don't make it to Ireland to get
mm,
cured.
mm.
Um,
Although I'd
but
argue,
I think,
Sophie, if I could break in for 1 second, I'd argue that there's a certain part of us which does know. It's
mhm.
just that we often aren't able to tap into that. And
Yeah,
and I would argue in the Tristan myth is that
yeah.
a part of him knew to take the harp.
Oh yeah, well, of
Um,
course.
yeah.
And I've written that the wound that he gets is the perfect shape. It leads him to love. That our wounds sometimes are compasses. So I think I love having multiple interpretations of myths and stories. It's just a biodiversity of perspectives is always healthier than just one. So
Mm,
in a certain way, I've looked at the Tristan myth as being like a direction for me, which is the wound points you in the right direction. And actually the exact poison that infects that wound, it fits exactly into a different story, into his partnership with Isolde. So it shows him where to go. But there's also, if we look at Tristan and Isolde as being this conflict of the hero's journey meeting these earlier Paleolithic mythic systems, we can see these moments where he tries to escape as being him trying to escape these heroes' journeys that fetishize trauma and initiation and suffering. That
mm,
he's always trying to jump off cliffs, to leave the story, to escape this conflation of trauma with evolution.
mm,
So yeah, but that being said, to go back to your question, I think so many of us right now are sick, and that instead of problematizing that and trying to come back into some kind of normativity that's just about entering back into the extractive capitalistic productivity that's being enshrined as wellness, that we can see how our wounds are doorways out of the anthropocentric narrative into involvement with our more than human kin. And it seems like you've really experienced that, and many people I know are turning to that biomythic perspective.
And so if we follow that thinking, if we find a cure for what ails us, we
Mhm.
may lose something. We may lose the most important thing to us in a way.
Well, there's no purity, right? If you can find a cure, you want the cure. You want to keep living.
Mm,
But I think, if someone comes along with an experimental medication that could cure me, I'll take it. But I also won't beat my back like a penitent for not healing. Like I won't say that, you know, that these symptoms are all bad. They're also like my body being played by me. But, I sometimes think that people whose bodies are glitchy are better instruments to play the weather systems and the climatological changes that are happening, that we amplify that music, that we perceive it with much more sensitivity. And that's painful. It's not comfortable, but it is perhaps important for other people to pay attention to.
mm.
We can look to the bodies of the chronically ill, those with PTSD, the neurodivergent, as being expert instruments at playing a more than human music right now.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and we see in a lot of myths the the wounded hero often gets some extrasensory power, like they can listen better, or they can see better, or one of the five senses becomes amplified in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think you've outlined that in your own experience, and I feel the same in mine. I'm sure there are others listening who feel the same way. Um,
Yeah.
it's a blessing and a curse in some respects, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that psychotherapy is so fixated on closing the wound. Well, here's a really real world explanation of wounds. So I've had actually some pretty serious physical wounds in my life. And they've taught me a lot. And I was way off the grid, hiking with friends in a very bad situation. I shouldn't have been doing this given my health issues. It was just not safe. And I'm definitely allergic to hornets and bees. And I was standing on a cliff over this shallow water. And there was like, one of my friends had kicked up like a hornet nest, and it stung my friends, and they were all swarming, and I jumped off the cliff because I knew that, like, if I got stung 2 hours from civilization, even with my EpiPens, I'd die. And so I jumped off the cliff, and I opened up an artery in my foot basically and broke it in like 8 different places and had a huge wound. And my life was saved by a friend with expert wilderness training who like tourniqueted me, carried me on his back out of the woods, brought me to the hospital. But when I got to the hospital, I had a juvenile like training doctor who did something very stupid, which is he closed the wound. And he closed the wound, which caused it was such a ragged, deep wound that it immediately necrotized. And what he did is, instead of healing it, he superficially made it look like it was closed so that it could just rot beneath. And it ended up with me being in the hospital for like a month and having all these like little surgeries. It was a whole thing. But what ended up having to happen is they needed to open the wound back up and dig it out again and again and explore it so that it could heal and reconstitute from the bottom up. And I sometimes think that we are very good culturally, mythically, narratively at just stitching the skin back together superficially. And then the rot happens below. And what we really need to do is keep wounds open, keep them open, look at them, explore them as like, bioscience as like a cartography, like walk them, see what new shapes come into view.
Mm. Wow, that's a hell of a story. But yeah, the idea.
It's well written than that, but yeah, it was disgusting.
Well, yeah. I mean, the idea of a wound as a doorway is really interesting to me. But firstly, I have to laugh and about jumping off the cliff and say how very psyche of you.
Well, I asked my team of doctors when I was in the hospital afterwards. I was like, did I make the right call? Because they were at that point, they were like, you may never walk again. Like, this is really bad. And they said, yeah, no, you would have died if you were bit by the hornet. This is perhaps better. So.
Wow. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the mistaken identities of some of these older, gods too, and particularly their connection to I've heard you call them vegetal gods, But the one I was most interested in, and I really want to leave some time for Q&A as well, so I hope you're okay with a little bit longer. But I'd love to hear you talk about Dionysus, because for me, Dionysus is, I guess, one of the healing gods. Is certainly that's been my understanding and my experience in my own journey as one of the gods that I feel sort of close to me in my healing journey. Yet he's called, the great loosener, and he's the dismemberer, and the way I see it is, he invites us to remember in a sense, but by doing that. But I heard you once say that you think there's been a great smear campaign.
Oh yeah.
Which was kind of executed around Dionysus. So I'd love to kind of hear your view about this god in particular.
Well, my book of Flowering Wand is like a deep explanation of this history and this whole process. So I'll give a short overview and say that if you want a much deeper cut version, that is, Dionysus is the deity that inspired that book, guided it, and threads it together. So I was really interested that in the Mediterranean basin, you see a bunch of figures that, while they are adapted to their specific locations and time periods, all seem to share attributes. So association with fermentation, with dance, with open air ecstasy, with protecting women, association with big cats, invasive species, and you see, and also with a cycle of rot and refruit, which is they're born, they disseminate ecstasy, ritual, dance, oftentimes fermentation, and then they're dismembered and mulched back into the land. So they never get stuck in one phase, that we don't prize ascent over descent. They all constitute the circle of life, that sometimes we have to die back in order to freshly adapt ourselves and refruit to be tailored to a different time period in a different circumstance. And Dionysus is interesting because although that he is now associated with Greek mythology, he far predates Greek mythology, that we see him first mentioned in Linear B on Crete, so in Minoan Bronze Age culture, which was partnership based. Most of the art and the iconography that comes from that time period is not based on singular human heroes or men, but on frescoes of bulls and snakes and weather systems and bees. So he comes from a time period where the human relationship with nature was much more centralized, ritually, spiritually, culturally. But then he becomes co-opted into a Greek pantheon. Interestingly enough, he's never called a deity in the same deos. He's called a daemon. He's always associated with theriomorphic gods, gods that are half animal. Sometimes it's said that he's born as a goat or as a bull or with snakes coming out of his head. I love that he's hard to pin down. And he's also always characterized as a stranger. He's always coming from outside the city into the city to disturb the idea of inside outside, that he creates, he's a breach, he's a break in the skin and in the established order. He's always, we can look at Euripides the Bacchae, which is one of the, most contemporary. We have to realize that by the time Euripides is writing the Bacchae, Dionysus has been around for 3,000 years. They were already getting the mistranslation of the mistranslation. But even in that crystallization of a Dionysian story, we see him coming into established hierarchy and disturbing that experience. And that he was seen as dangerous because he inspired slave revolts. He was the inspiration behind Spartacus, that he could help, the outcasts, the minorities, the people who are downtrodden, access their wild, feral, revolutionary capabilities. But the Romans become very, very scared of him because he actively inspires all of these revolts, near successful revolts. So he's the only god that's ever outlawed, officially outlawed, 200 years before Jesus comes along, which is interesting. And 7,000 people are put to death. It's the first religious persecution in Europe and in the Mediterranean basin that we can see, with mass execution. So all of the Dionysian followers are killed. And then what I find fascinating is suddenly one of the most popular sexy religions is illegal. And there are all of these people who still have this mythic system of a god who comes from the lap of God, is a son of God, associated with wine and bread. All of these people saying, all right, our practice is illegal. And then Jesus comes along and they're like, oh, we'll just give him this name. And there's a beautiful thing, which is the Gospel of John, which is the last gospel to be written of the canonical gospels, and and most scholars say has nothing to do with Jesus' life, lifts whole passages from Euripides. And it was written, I think, in Ephesus for a community of Dionysian followers who were looking for an easier, safer worship structure. So the Gospel of John is Euripides the Bacchae. There's been amazing scholarship just showing that whole parts are lifted and translated. Yeah. So that's my little rant.
No, I mean, it's fascinating to me that there's been this sort of long line of vegetal gods, or perhaps the same god, leading up to Jesus, and then what? Have we seen anything?
Well, I always say that Jesus, he's the last. He's the interruption in the process. Okay. Because and that's the thesis of my whole book, which is that these gods are cyclical, they're lunar, they never get stuck. But with Jesus, his body never goes back to the land. It evaporates. You know, he's an interruption in the cycle of rot and refruit. And if we actually look at ecology, we can see that interruptions in these natural cycles can create huge, huge disturbances. And my favorite of which is during the Carboniferous period, the first woody plants developed, like trees, but there wasn't the fungi, white rot hadn't evolved yet that was capable of breaking that down. There was nothing that could break it down. So when these trees died, there was a proliferation of them. So there were a lot of them that grew all at once. They couldn't become soil, they couldn't rot, and they swamped the whole world such that it actually created a climate event. It created like a mini ice age and killed off lots and lots of species. And it's that compacted, undigested matter that are the fossil fuels of today. And so it's so interesting to me that when we interrupt this cycle of rot, when we pretend like we don't need to rot back into the ground and into our own bodies, that we can create the mechanism for real violence. And so I think Jesus is an interruption in that cycle, that he's very much like that moment in the Carboniferous period.
Mm. So does it begin again at some point? I guess we'll see.
I would hope it's happening right now.
Yeah.
I would hope that right now we're coming back into our root systems. And it seems, I mean, if your inquiry exists, it's happening.
Well, I think conversations like this are part of the process, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think
have some kind of like I don't know if optimism is the word. Optimism doesn't feel correct, but there's some kind of material survival urge that we're all summoning right now. Like we will keep telling stories. We will continue to gather at all odds.